Hello, everyone. Thanks for remaining here until the last presentation of the day. Obviously, it means that the previous speakers were very good. Hopefully, you will still be okay at that level. We will go back a little bit from barrels to wine. So to close a little bit the day with a bit of wine stories as we move towards lunch, and we will be drinking some wine, hopefully good wine, I think. There's been during the morning a few times the discussion has gone towards sulfur compounds. Okay, we've been talking about sulfur compounds quite a bit, both during the presentation of Antonio and Vicente and Monica concerning reduction, so certain off flavors that might occur in the wine. In some cases, some sulfur compounds that we still call reductive might not be that bad. There are other sulfur compounds that we really want to have in a wine. And very recently, I mean, during the last 10, 15 years probably, people have been talking about these compounds a lot in the context particularly of white wines, starting from Sauvignon Blanc and then expanding to Verdejo, to Riesling, to Chardonnay, with the so-called varietal aromas that in certain varieties are very much like passion fruit, grapefruit, which seem to be very, very interesting for today's consumers. So I will try to capture some elements that are coming from research done by others and research done by us with a focus on some practical aspects of it. So what happens to these compounds during winemaking, and which could be factors that winemakers want to think about if they're interested in playing with these compounds, the good ones and the bad ones. Okay, first of all, I think it's worth thinking a little bit from the point of view of a winemaker. What is today the trends that we observe in the market, which seem to be the styles of wines that today the market seem to prefer? I think if we look at the press around wine, you know, magazines like Wine Spectator or things like that, wine books, guides, there seem to be certain descriptors that for red wines and for white wines seem to be the most trendy, if you want, ones. I think very much in red wines, we have attributes that are revolving around red fruit, black fruits that are very, very popular for today's consumers. Spicy chocolate aromas also seem to be quite interesting for today's consumers and for critics as well. In the case of white wines, we have a range of attributes going, as I said, from passion fruit to grapefruit, fresh fruit, of course, some dry fruits seem to be interesting. In certain styles, some smoky aromas could be interesting. There are also the things that obviously seem to be less popular, seem to be the things that prevent some wines to gain prizes in magazines, in books, and so on. For example, people and critics seem to disregard wines with astringents that are very tannic, with body that is not so expressive, and reduction, as we heard in the morning. So it could mask fruity aromas, it could also give a bit of disgusting odors to the wines. The interesting things for the purpose of the discussion we're having today is that in our experience is more and more becoming clear, and some of it has been coming also in the discussion in the morning, that some of these attributes can be modulated by playing with oxygen, particularly oxygen during the period of bottle aging. So as the wine sits in the bottle where it develops all this complexity, the amount of oxygen that is present in the process can allow to create wines that have more or less of these attributes. And of course, we all know that if we give too much oxygen, we also have oxidation problems, and we had in the talk. So all these attributes, some of which are not very good, like the reduction and the extreme reduction and the extreme oxidations, but some others are part of what we call complexity and style, can be modulated to a certain extent by having oxygen in the picture. So for the purpose of today, they seem to be very interesting topic to look at. And certainly there are some of them, as I said, which seem to be very much in line with consumers' preference today, with critics, with parameters that critics take to assign awards and things like that, particularly this range of attributes for white wines and a little bit more this range of attributes in the case of red wines. Now, what is interesting for the side of the story that has to do with sulfur compounds is that a lot of these attributes, as you can see, are directly related to what we call thiols, so sulfur compounds, which we'll look in a minute, that have a specific chemistry. And some others we will see towards the end of the talk, they're not probably directly linked to these compounds, but when they're present or not present, or when there's a lot or very little, some of the other attributes are also modulated by these compounds. So for example, the black fruit, red fruit character. Okay, I said already before, I come from Italy, and so when I was a children in Italy, there was something very popular, which was spaghetti Western movies, okay? So I think in Spain they were pretty popular because they were actually shot in Spain as well. So all the Sergio Leone, the Sergio Corbucci, these guys were working in Spain to make these movies. There's always, in the stories, there's always a bad guy. It's always going to be a bad guy. There's always a good guy. And then there's a guy that is a bit mysterious. We don't understand very well if he's doing bad or good, but it adds complexity to the story, okay? So very often when we look at these sulfur compounds, we can make an analogy along the same lines, because these compounds are very different from a structural point of view. They have something in common, which is this SH group, which we're going to talk in a minute. And again, with the spaghetti Western, they all had in common guns, okay? There's no guy in the spaghetti Western that doesn't play with a gun. So in a way, the gun for these guys is a little bit this particular part of the molecule, which you see it comes back all the time, even if the rest of the molecule is different. It's not very important to look at the structure in detail, but keep in mind there's some elements of these compounds that make them similar. But from a sensory point of view, they can be very different. We can have compounds that, generally speaking, at the levels that they are in a wine, could contribute very much to fruity aromas. Some others will play a bit more the complexity role, and some others will be the bad guys. These are all sulfur compounds, as I said, and that's where the analogy comes in. You always have a good guy, which, it's the guy we like in the story. There's the bad guy. There's always somebody that we don't understand yet what he does, but it adds complexity, makes the story more intriguing. So keep this in mind. These compounds play multiple roles in the context of wine. The reason why there's been, as I said, a lot of interest in these compounds in recent years is because somebody in Bordeaux, I think, historically, started to look at them, and they say the aroma of Sauvignon Blanc, it really depends from these compounds. This passion fruit, grapefruit aromas, a little bit of cat urine as well, that in some Sauvignon Blanc it comes out very strong. It's really depending on these compounds. And this is found so much approval in terms of the styles of wines that were developed based on these concepts around the world. The New Zealand industry is all made around this type of very aromatic Sauvignon Blanc. A lot of countries have been trying to follow these. Then we found that a lot of varieties that we didn't think were similar to Sauvignon Blanc could be made a little bit similar. So there's a lot of enology around that. When we look at these compounds in the context of wine aging, which I said is a very important part of developing this complexity, because of a lot of chemical reactions that I'm not going to go very much in detail, these compounds we're going to lose these fruity aromas. And that's one of the reasons why some Sauvignon Blancs that are very intense in aromas, we say they should be drank within 1 year from bottling, okay? We don't consider Sauvignon Blanc a wine for long aging. It's not like a Chardonnay or a Riesling that you might age for 20 years. So we're going to lose them. And so in terms of the style of wine that some consumers might be after, that's not a good thing. So people are typically saying, when you want to keep these compounds, you have to give little oxygen to the wine during bottling. So that means very controlled bottling, as we had before, and that means also a closure that allows very little oxygen in the picture, in the bottle. And that's why, for example, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc are all under screw cap, because that's a closure that allows very little oxygen. Of course, there are some tricky sides of things that we have to look at when we look at bottling in a screw cap, but in general, it's a closure that allows strong protection. So we keep those fruity aromas, which is good. Depending on the style of wine, the type of grapes, the type of winemaking, certain wines under these conditions of very little oxygen will develop a bit more complexity. So again, the side of story that some consumers might like, some others might not like. In some styles, we call it terroir. In some other styles, we don't know what it is. But it's there and it's part of the story. But then, as we've seen in the slide from Vicente towards the end, some wines have a tendency to develop these bad compounds, the hydrogen sulfide, the methyl mercaptan, the bad sulfur compounds, the disgusting smelling ones. And because they're all part of this similar chemistry, when we keep the wine away from oxygen, these compounds could accumulate to a higher level if the wine has the potential to do that. So not all wines will do that, but when we are with the wrong wine, which has really this potential to do so, it could be very, very dangerous to try and protect it too much from oxygen. The thing, as I said, is that it's not always easy to find this balance, because even in the spaghetti Western story, sometimes we don't know if we like the bad guy or the complex guy, and sometimes even the good guy or the complex, the tricky guy, but sometimes even the bad guy Some sides of it, we might like it. Problem is that we looked at some of these compounds in the context of similar wines, and we see that, again, every time we try to keep the good guys, we have the other guys in the picture as well. So it's not so easy for a winemaker to find a balance of how much of these compounds could be good and which wine is the wine to play with all this story and which ones we should leave it alone and not do too much about it. And in fact, it's also a more complex picture than that, because there are some wines then, which is a little bit like the story Monica presented regarding the aldehydes. Sometimes, for a similar level of good guys, we can find a lot more of the bad guys. So there are some wines that really have this tendency to develop the bad guys. So we call them outliers, in the sense that they go out of a little bit this picture, because with this picture, if it was so simple, we could try to make some sense of it. But there are some wines that really behave in a different way. We don't always understand why that is. I wouldn't spend too much time on this because I think we've seen it before already from Antonio and from Vicente. So you know everything about now the radicals, the quinones, the things that are forming. One aspect that on a practical level becomes more interesting, and I think in terms of research also more modern today, is to try to understand when we form these quinones and the radicals, which we say they propagate the reaction chain, how they interact in the wine environment. Of course, in the wine environment, we have the possibility for these compounds to react with the sulfur compounds we just said. They form a very good pair. They're very reactive against each other. That means that if we're talking about the good sulfur compounds, we're going to lose them when we oxidize the wine. But the bad guys, we can get rid of them if we oxidize the wine a little bit. They could react with some amino acids, as we say, and they could form aldehydes. They could react with tannins. That means bitterness, other things. And there's a bit of competition between all these things. There's also SO2, as we heard in the picture, that could have play a lot of modulation role. And there's also some other antioxidants. I think Antonio mentioned this one in the morning, glutathione, which is a thiol itself as well, because it has the same SH group, it has the same guns that the other guys have. So it can really interfere a lot in this particular side of the story when it comes to the effect of oxygen on the aroma sulfur compounds. Glutathione can play a big role there. Okay, so far it doesn't look very good probably, because everything I'm saying that we cannot make any choice between these compounds. Every time we try to do something about the good guys, we find the bad guy in the picture. So we always have to watch the movie until the end, and then we see if we like it or not. From a winemaker's point of view, that's not always very practical, because winemakers like to make decisions at certain points and be as sure as possible that that decision is the good decision. Luckily, it's not so bad, in that research has shown that the bad compounds, so the hydrogen sulfide, for example, the one that drives reduction, seem to be a lot more responsive to oxygen than the ones that are driving the fruity aromas. So we can play a little bit with oxygen and hope that the first effect we see is the removal of the bad compounds. And we don't worry too much about losing the good compounds, because they come after, they react after. So you see in this example, we had a Sauvignon Blanc which we exposed to 4 milligrams of oxygen in 6 months, 4 milligrams per liter, or 1.4 in the two cases. And you see going from 1.4 to 4, the bad compound, we remove it to a very good extent, whereas the good compound, yes, we lose a little bit, but it's not an extreme loss. So there seems to be a potential to play with oxygen in this sense and to get some benefits. Of course, what we're still missing in the picture is which are the wines where this will happen, which are the wines that we have a high risk for this, which are the wines where we should give more oxygen. The outliers, as I say, the ones that have this tendency to develop reduction. Now, I'm hoping that from the presentation we heard this morning, research will help winemakers to make some advances in this identification and prediction of the ones that are risky. In the story of our research, we were able to make some observation more than really predictions. One observation we made was that the wines that are made under very reductive conditions, they come in. You know, we talked before about at some point pressing, inner pressing, conditions that really we tend to operate without any oxygen during the winemaking process. Or we do aging on lees, which also protects the wine from oxygen. Or we add certain antioxidants that are very active, such as glutathione, for example. These ones are very good at retaining the fruity aroma, so we don't lose the good aromas in these wines very much. They're very strong against that. But these are also the wines that sometimes tend to be the ones that develop more of the bad aromas. So the environment that we create with the reductive condition is seen to promote a little bit the capacity of the wine to develop some of these aromas during time. So these could be good candidates to need a bit more oxygen because their big problem would be around the risk of having too much reduction. Whereas other wines, for example, the wines where we don't take so much of these precautions, they might have less of the fruity compounds. And so, of course, we have to protect them a little bit more because there's already not enough and we could lose more in these wines. But they don't seem to have a tendency to develop high risk of reduction. So these wines could be good candidates for being protected when they go in the bottle. Whereas these guys here, they might want a little oxygen when they go in the bottle so that we prevent the bad guys from becoming very dominant in these ones. Now again, these are just observations that we made over a series of small studies, so we cannot really generalize. But it's something to keep in mind when winemakers are playing with some of these elements, is really this side of the story. Talking about things that winemakers do, I've been living for a few years in Australia, and in Australia, winemakers, because there's a screw cap land, okay, all wines are going under screw cap in Australia, winemakers have developed ways to fight against reduction and to prevent wines from becoming more reductive. One thing is done all the time in Australia, and I think it's done in a lot of other countries as well, is to add copper before bottling or during winemaking, especially a little bit extra before bottling, just in case the wine will turn reductive, okay? And this has been known for a long time. I think there are some countries where it's very spread as a practice, some others is a little bit less. I don't know very much about Spain, but I know that in Italy, for example, it's becoming more popular. The reason for this is that copper binds to thiols, okay? So any type of thiol we have in the picture, the copper will remove it. And the idea is to have a bit more copper around. So if any thiol will form later, as we heard, during bottling or at a later stage, the copper will remove it away. Now, this is very anecdotal, and I think it's very much based on the observation that if there is any reduction, copper will remove it. But the way copper will operate when the wine sits in the bottle, all the studies we did, it didn't seem to confirm that copper is a good idea. And the reason for this is essentially that. The first thing, as I said, if there's any thiol in the picture, copper will bind to it. Now, if one is very reductive, because of fermentation gone wrong or because in the winery something happening, you add copper to it, you will remove it. We also heard from Vicente that this complex, it could come back later as it could form a potential for copper, for reduction forming again. So already it's not a good idea. But even before that, if you're looking at a wine that has some thiols in it, the good varietal thiols, the fruity ones, you add copper to it, you will remove those compounds as well. So you see, and this is very rapid, it happens instantly, nearly instant. So here we have the wine that it was as it was. He had 0.2 milligrams per liter of copper. We didn't add anything. Or we added a little bit to bring it to 0.5 milligrams per liter. So this is very little copper. Right? It's really, really a micro dose that we added. Already we went down to nearly half of the fruity thiol, the trimercaptohexanol, one of the fruity thiols that we had. We already lost half of it. When we look at this same wine after 6 months in the bottle, actually the wines where we had added copper have formed more hydrogen sulfide. So not only they lost some of the good guys to begin with, they're also gone into some strange, we thought at the time, with strange chemistry, which we still don't understand completely, where over time these ones are also forming more hydrogen sulfide. Now, I don't know how this could link into the observation that Vicente reported about the possibility of some precursors existing and having to do with some complex that might evolve later. But again, there seems to be an influence at that level. And the data that we have, even if we're not able to interpret completely, they seem to indicate that adding copper is high risk, certainly high risk of losing the good guys, and it doesn't give any guarantee that we will protect the wines against the bad guys later in time. So it's really didn't seem to be a good idea at all. And plus, as you know, copper can promote some oxidation reactions as well if it's very, very excessive. So in our experience, scientifically speaking, all the data we could collect in a very structured way, not just stories, but really experimental data, didn't seem to support the idea of adding copper. In red wines, things are a little bit more complicated because, as we heard before, the metric is more complex. There's a lot of phenolics there that are playing a role. Okay, so what we did, we had a study on 2 Shiraz wines, and we could really see in this slide the way different wines will respond to oxygen. So again, the picture is very complex. We have one wine here. Here is the sensory space of these wines, okay? So you have one wine, the area here where we have the more developed attributes, the jam, the chocolate, the more oxidative type of profile. Here we have very much the red fruit aromas, and here we have the reduction. And you see that there is one wine that, as we give it less and less oxygen, is really losing the fruit and going into reduction. So this is wine number 1. So this is a wine with a tendency to reduction. Again, we're not able to predict it, we don't understand it, but we made this observation a lot of times. Some wines have this tendency. When you protect them from oxygen, they lose the good expression, the good fruit, and they just go in reduction mode. So, and this reduction is really where we have these compounds, as we say, the mercaptans and the hydrogen sulfide. So it seems to be that certain wines, they really have to be given some oxygen to express these complex fruit characters, because otherwise they lose them. So even if maybe it's not a direct effect, there is an interaction there, and these ones are not expressing the fruity aromas. But there is another wine, wine number 2, that is not characterized by these aromas at all. It doesn't have a tendency to go for reduction, and in fact, it has a tendency to go for more oxidative aromas. So this could be a good wine to protect a little bit more from oxygen. Now, from a winemaker's perspective, I think most people will say, if they have to guess what was number 1 and what was number 2, or 2 Shiraz wines, okay? But if you had to give them an attribute, you would say, most likely wine number 1 will be a wine with a big structure, a lot of tannins, a lot of color. And wine number 2 is a very fragile, very low tannins, very medium body wine, so it's really easy oxidized. Actually, in this experiment, it was complete opposite. Wine number 1, it was nearly like a claret, so it was a very light red, very little tannins, very little body, but it shows this. Wine number 2 was a big body, but it didn't age very well from the point of view of oxygen. So it's not a wine that you think you'll give it a lot of oxygen and it will develop the good aroma. So it's actually more the opposite. So again, there are observations we can make today. There are things we don't understand, but the potential for oxygen, for everybody to play with oxygen and try to understand your own wine, it offers a lot of opportunities in terms of creating different wine styles and optimizing the expression of each individual wine. The point becomes how much oxygen is good oxygen. How am I going with time? Okay, I'll be quick. It's not easy, especially when it comes to closure, because the amounts that can make a difference can be very little. Here, without going too much in detail, you see that by giving, in this sensory space where the reduction is here and the good tropical fruit is here, by going over 12 months from 0.6 to 1.2, we can really shift the balance from a reductive wine to a tropical, nice fruit aromas. So it's very little. It's very little oxygen that could make a difference. In this case, it was 0.6. More in general, Sauvignon Blanc is very responsive. Some other wines could be a bit more, but really in the white wines, we're in a narrow range that can make a difference. A little bit more over in red wines for 1 year, but still the range is pretty narrow. So what does it mean practically? For people who want to play with oxygen post-bottling, so that people who want to choose certain closures, for example, is really that these are measures we made in our laboratory over batches of 10 closures, the same batch, different products, but for each one we measure 10 pieces, 10 closures. You see, of course, the permeability. We all know that the permeability is very different. There are some closures that are very low. There are some others that are not very low. I'm not going to go into that. But one point I want to bring up is that regardless of the permeability that you choose for a style or for other reason, there is one aspect that is very important, is are these closures always the same from one batch to another or from one closure to another? Because having closures that could be very different from one to another will lead to what we call bottle-to-bottle variation. So you take 10 bottles, you close them with the same product. After a certain period of time, the closures will be the wines will be different, sensorially speaking, chemically speaking as well, but most important, sensorially different. And we see that some closures are, and we know, I mean, natural materials typically are very variable, so they're more exposed to this risk of high variations. Some synthetic closures actually made with different certain processes, injected molded, so the old generation of closures, synthetic closures, could be not so good in that sense as well. They could really create big variations between one bottle and another. Some of the closures are better, and lucky enough, thanks to our technology, which is really a continuous process, we managed to be in a pretty good range. So that's something really to consider when you want to choose a closure, when you want to play with oxygen during post-bottling, because you heard in the morning, bottling, the oxygen and bottling is one factor of the post-bottling process, but the other one that really allows you to play with oxygen is very much the closure you choose. So not only think at the permeability as a value, so don't ask only, oh, okay, what's the permeability? It's low, that's okay. I'll put it on a Sauvignon Blanc, it's high. I'll put it on a Tempranillo that wants to age only 3 months, but it's got big tannins. Also think about the fact that some of these permeabilities, we declare a value, you choose a value, but then it could be all over the place, which could complicate a lot the quality of your wine when it reaches consumers. Thank you. So that was it.